Welcome to SUP, the Super Urban Podcast, a discussion on cities coming from RMIT Architecture and Urban Design in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. I'm Ian Nazareth.
I'm Graham Christ.
And I'm Christine Phillips.
Ask a physicist and they'll tell you that the universe is mostly made of something we cannot see. Ordinary matter, everything tangible, measurable, visible, makes up less than 5% of reality. The rest is dark matter, an unseen force shaping galaxies, bending space, and governing what is possible. But what about the urban and architectural consciousness? What unseen forces, economic, legal, institutional, shape the city before a single form emerges? If we begin to make these forces visible, architecture itself may need to be retooled. It may no longer be enough to think at the scale of objects, buildings, or even cities. We may need to redesign institutions and infrastructures at the planetary scale, to rethink governance, finance, and civic agency in response to extractive geopolitics, corporate colonialism, and economic weaponisation. Perhaps the future of architecture is not just about designing buildings or institutions, but about designing new agents, new citizens, and new counter-infrastructures, the hidden architectures of regenerative futures. Today, we're speaking with Indy Johar, a thinker at the forefront of this shift, a designer of systems, infrastructures, and institutional geometries, to explore what it means to remake the world by redesigning its civic firmware.
Indy is a British architect and serial social entrepreneur dedicated to systemic change and the development of collaborative frameworks for societal transformation. He co-founded Dark Matter Labs, an organisation focused on reimagining and redesigning institutional infrastructure to address contemporary challenges. Prior to this, Johar co-founded Architecture 00, a REBA award-winning architecture and urban design practice. Johar's commitment to open source initiatives is evident in his involvement with projects like WikiHouse, an open source housing solution, and Open Desk, a platform for open source furniture design. Indy, thank you for joining us in the studio today and welcome to the Super Urban Podcast. We're keen to talk to you about the Planetary Civics Initiative, and we'll get there soon. But perhaps a way to understand your practice, process, and chronology, and to come at it from the other end of the scale spectrum. WikiHouse and Open Desk presented a radical rethinking. They proposed open source design platforms that decentralize production by providing downloadable blueprints for buildings and furniture, enabling local fabrication and shifting architectural agency from centralized industries to distributed networks. Architecture, from our view, I think it's fair to say, has traditionally been a closed-loop discipline, with authorship tethered to the singular authority of the architect or architecture practice. Open source platforms disrupt this economy of expertise. Equally, this is a position on democratization at its core, not a power structure, but a way to script and construct social structures. If architecture becomes a set of protocols rather than objects, how do you think this dispersion of agency empower or disempower the disciplines? How does it reshift and reposition the role of the architect within society? And what opportunities do you think this makes available?
Delighted to be here. Thank you for the question. I think the democratization of the means of democratization. Yeah, you can't. Okay. Let me start. Firstly, thank you. Delighted to be here. It's a really important question. I think, even the name 00 as a practice, we picked that because we didn't want to root ourselves in the theory of the hero architects. And why 00? Well, in Germany, 0 is the infrastructure of the toilets, the corridors. It's the things that create the infrastructure. We didn't want to create a superstructure for design, but the infrastructure of design. So that was a kind of intentional act. But as you rightly say, the democratization of the means of production of architecture in terms of what OpenDesk and WikiHouse were attempting to do was a deeper democracy. Representation is just representation, and the vote is a thin democracy. If the means of production, the means of making our cities is not distributed, then we are actually still operating in a weak democracy. And so one of our core principles was, how do you democratize actually the means of production of architecture? Now, that doesn't get rid of the architect, frankly. I think what it starts to do is turn the architect to being an advanced teaching system, as opposed to being an advanced production system. When you decentralize the means of production, you go into co-designing. You still are designing. People are still personalizing their context, and it's the co-design process of understanding meaning in the particular that becomes really critical. And I think any architect working certainly with individual clients realizes that part of the process is building the core shared understanding of the world and shared utility of how to see and operate in the world. And by the world, I mean the house or the space that they're living in, and understanding that it's, so colloquially, a lot of my friends who do this work describe it as almost like marriage counseling at the level of relationship formation. So because it forces you to be reflective about the lives that you lead and the preferences that you hold, and to then be able to code those preferences or enhance those preferences or bias those preferences positively and negatively. So architecture is not just the act of production, it's the act of meaning making and comprehension. So I think this also creates a new relationship of architecture and the role of the architect to the means of production in really radical ways. And secondly, I think it starts to return architecture into a craft product, as opposed to one of my big problems is architecture is a product of modernity. It's a product of the disassociation of the means of production and the design. So it becomes an instructional art, an instructional economy, where the privilege of some architects sitting around are instructing the laborer, the act of labor, to use that brick with that bond and that moment in time. So what we've reduced other people to is the minimum utility instructable theory of labor, and we've abstracted the intelligence or the value into the hands of the not so valued architects, which I think has been part of the industrial separation of design and making. And I think the refusion of that into the means of craft and co-production, I think, is a really co-part of working in complexity and also working with a new integrity on that ground.
Do you think that's a radical shift? Because we there is a sort of, you use the word relationship. Really, it's from... There is something about that foregrounding of relationship building that I think this new paradigm, or the new thinking of the role of the architect in the current and future economies is a role somewhat of facilitation, isn't it?
Yes, but I think what makes architecture as a discipline interesting for me is the ability to understand the needs and respond obliquely to the answers. I think the problem with, and this is what makes it a synthetic or a synthesis-orientated discipline rather than an analytical discipline. I think an analytical discipline could very well understand the problem engineering of what is the engineering of the problem. But what makes design, I think, fundamentally different from a problem analytical discipline, which I think, is the ability to find oblique pathways to resolving multiple issues. I think, if you look systemically into this question, the language of the client is one of the most destructive pieces of language into pieces of architecture. And because architecture isn't a function of a client, the client is merely the seeder. And actually what the client of a piece of architecture is multiple clients, human clients into the future, but also multiple species and multiple ecologies and multiple temporal effects. So if you start to really genuinely look at this multi-relational piece of architecture, you start to operate differently. And I think that opens up really important grounds with regards to the ethics, and not a kind of a false morality of architecture, but a genuine relational responsibility, which I'm kind of, which I'm deeply interested in. So I think it's this isn't just a sort of name shift, or a sort of, it's really saying, how do you create synthetic or synthesize? How do you create, move away and multi-solve simultaneously? How do you do many of these things simultaneously? So I think it's fundamentally different. And I think the problem is our language is locked into quite an industrial idea or a modernity idea of design, which is rooted in a very old-fashioned model.
Yeah, Indy, I'm really interested in language, and I guess the idea that you've got to call it something for it to exist. And so universal, basic, nutrient income, community-led place stewardship, regenerative contracting, permissioning, the boring revolution, planetary civics, etc. They're not just labels, but they're working tools. And they carve out, I guess, a conceptual space where none previously existed. And so institutions, policies, and financial instruments are just as spatial, I guess, as streets and buildings. But without the right terminology, they remain invisible infrastructures, shaping outcomes without scrutiny. And I think a lot of the work of Dark Matter Labs is also the business of naming the invisible so it can be designed. And if words are also spatial instruments, then language is not just a means of communication, but a means of construction. So, Indy, have we got the language to articulate the problem? And how do you approach the task of conceptualizing the projects, the terminology, and not just as rhetorical exercises, but as a tool for institutional and systemic transformation?
No, we don't have the language. And often we're trapped by old language, like language like client or language like customer. These languages are hard-coding relationships into what should be liquid frameworks of re-understanding those relationships. So I think there is, commons. Like, it's great language, great. Everyone defaults to the theory of commons, but unfortunately, and Ellen Ahlstrom was an amazing thinker. But the reality is, and I can speak to most architects who unfortunately operate in what I would call derivative knowledge landscapes. So they will not read the primary work, they'll read the reference of the work itself, and to be able to create synthetics about that information. The challenge is most of the commons thinking was bounded on bounded commons. Our problem of carbon dioxide is not a bounded commons problem, it's an unbounded commons problem. Microplastics is an unbounded common. Most of our supply chains are unbounded or relational problem spaces as opposed to bounded problem spaces. So I think our ability to be able to not only, like, this is why I don't like words like community, right? Because community is a bounded idea. It is who's inside the community, who's outside the community. To be in communion is better because it's a behavior model, right? I'd speak to most architects, they'll go, oh, localism is great. And then I sort of say, fantastic. Tell me about your clothes and where they come from. And, let's strip away everything that isn't local and they're left standing naked in that conversation. Because the reality is, the local is a kind of a political pejorative, which doesn't understand the systemic reality of actually how we're existing on a planetary scale. Your lungs, my lungs, are breathing air from plankton in the ocean, and if not the Amazon. The illusion of the localism is a political object, not a biophysical object. And I think the political object is now actually a problem because it's rooted in bounded models of thinking. So one of the big challenges that we've got is how do you move from bounded models of thinking to relational models of thinking? How do you move from noun-orientated object models of thinking to verb models of thinking? How do you actually start to see the house and the forest as not as a symbiotic design problem, not the house as the design problem? How do you see the problem of not single-point optimization, but multi-point optimization? How do you create the contractual and governance relationships that operate across that reality? This fundamentally starts to create a new paradigm of architecture and also a new morality, but not a morality of infinite debates, but morality as a function of the relationship of value and harm that's intrinsic in the governance of the thing.
I mean, I'm also interested in talking about language and the role of language in reimagining a new worldview. And Indy, I'm not sure if you're on top of what's been going on in architectural practice in Australia, particularly in the last 10 years, where we've been going through a process of reconciling with our very brutal colonial past, and we've now embraced a First Nations term within architecture design practice, the term country with a capital C, where architects are now trying to understand and grapple with what it might mean to design with country. And from a First Nations perspective, this is very much describing an interrelational network of animals, of waterways, of insects, of sky country, of people, which sort of fractures our understanding of how we used to talk about designing within a site as being a fixed by title boundaries, and instead a much broader set of relationships. I do remain somewhat sceptical about how that's playing out. On the one hand, it is helping non-Indigenous architects in Australia to reimagine a new worldview. However, I wonder whether language also might become a convenient lip service rather than actually contributing to driving change. Have you got any? Because I feel like, on the one hand, language is changing our perspective, but we're still bound by a lot of other forces that are slowing us down.
So I would argue that we're living in the intersection of at least three spaces, say in Melbourne. We're living in a deep time, or sort of relatively deep time of 76,000 years of constant inhabitation, maybe not in Melbourne, but certainly in parts. We're living in an expansion of an Enlightenment worldview layered over that. And then we're also living, I think, also in increasingly in Oriental inhabitation. And the question for me is, what is possible at the intersection of these worldviews? And I think all of these, and so from an Indigenous perspective, it's often talked about two-eyed seeing or multi-eyed seeing perspectives. And I think there's greater, and I think for me, one is, how do we talk about this multi-eyed or three-eyed ways of seeing across that landscape? Two, I think we're going through this kind of natural process of what I would call, the first version of something is skeuomorphic. It's almost an imitation of what you need to do, what you think you need to do. And we're now in the skeuomorphic stage of Apple's interface, so you make it look like a book, even though it's a digital app, because it looks like a representation of something, so it's a cultural coding process. And over time, this will become more sophisticated. But also, it's not, currently we're living in the languages, in the sophistication of language, not the sophistication of institutions, to marry against that. So if we do talk about country in that relational way, which I think is right, then design is a knot in the flow of things. It is literally a knot. It ties a knot of space-time knots. And if we start to see design that way, we have to also start to construct the new governances of how do you govern them, who owns the liability for the governance of that carbon, who owns the contribution, who owns the responsibility of a house which is acting as a pollinator accelerant, who owns who has the responsibilities to be able to do that. So I think what we now have to do is take the entangled perspective at a cultural level and be able to embody it into our institutional frameworks. And then we can start to talk about something slightly more profound, which I think will start to happen as we move away from what I would call a skeuomorphic interpretation of that world into a systemic interpretation, which is, I think, the real invitation on the other side of this story.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really good point. And I think you had a question on governance as well.
Yeah, I thought that might, leads to, a discussion on speculative governance, bureaucracy, and also institutional plasticity. And I guess it's if governance and policy are also forms of design, or at least subject to principles of design, how do we create more agile bureaucracies and ones that can adapt at the speed of this planetary crisis? And How do we prototype new legal, financial and civic infrastructures in real time rather than merely imagining them in the abstract?
So, I mean, a lot of our work is rooted in that, in the doing of that, and I think the key learnings I'm getting is our policy landscape is rooted in the idea of defining things, define the good or the bad. Imagine a policy landscape which was rooted in the efficacy of learning.
Mm-hmm.
So it was optimizing for continuous adaptation on the basis of learning as opposed to optimizing for a preconceived outcome. I think that fundamentally changes what you're governing for. And in complexity, increasingly, one of the big paradigmatic shifts we're moving from is a theory of control to a theory of learning as a means of coordination. Learning as a means of coordination and meta-learning is increasingly critical in complex systems as a means of coherence formation as opposed to control. Mm-hmm. So something at that level. Second thing, I think what becomes really clear is that there's a role, and I think we are seeing that in our new computational bureaucracy, our landscapes of creating digitized bureaucratic relationships that shift the paradigm of what you're organizing for. So, for example, we're doing work on permission in the city, which is really looking at how do you construct permissions in radical new ways. Now, if you detach architecture from the permission, i.e. architecture is no longer a house, and remember, let's go back to the conversation about language. Mm-hmm. A house is a single utility function to which we're describing a piece of intervention. If architecture is fundamentally a multi-solving issue, the house is a house, the house is an ecology regenerator, the house is an energy generator, a house is a water regenerator, a house is a pollinator. It's no longer a house, right? So once you start to look at permissions not through the theory of the single point optimization of function, but you look at it as a multi-solving thing, what are you regulating for in the first place? Right. And regulation of function becomes actually maybe even a much more dynamic negotiation, but negotiation between who and for what. Mm-hmm. So the theory, as we start to move into this world, you're starting to also talk about how you move into a new thesis of regulation, which might be real-time, smart, contingent models of regulation, looking at outcome model of regulation, which is looking at the level of noise pollution, level of water pollution. So you're not trying to control the function, but you're controlling the parametrics of harm. And that can now be coded. That starts to fundamentally change the typology of architecture from being not architecture through function, but the idea of landscape formation for the intensity of relationships and dialogue in different forms of reflective spaces. So silence, maybe your characteristic typologies of spaces might be to do with silence, might be to do with other definitive qualities which are much more embodied in space than they would be on functionality. So I think that's just an example of how the relationship between our means of governance, our means of regulating, actually transform the landscape of architecture. So the real purpose behind Permission the City is to disrupt our theory of planning and disrupt planning as a means of regulating cities and open up a fundamentally different paradigm of what is the nature of architecture. Remember, when you change the idea of architecture, you also change the idea of finance. Finance is rooted in the theories of asset classes. You can get a mortgage on a house. You cannot get a mortgage, personal mortgage on an office. So what you start to find is that these asset classes become different, and so the asset theory becomes different, thereby your financing theory becomes different, and thereby the whole chain is disrupted. So what we look for is these chain points. My one caution into this, and I just want to state this because I want DM has evolved to be in this position.
Right.
It wasn't designed to be in this position. I didn't sit down and kind of go, right, we're going to disrupt planning like this. It has taken a history of looking at social investment, not just looking at doing social investment, setting up multiple startups, working in policy, to be able to come to this position. It's taken a team of people that work between policy, finance, digital tech. So the polymathic capabilities of DM, I think maybe architects and designers are something like about 15 to 20% of the team, right, just to give you a quantum. So why I say this is not in any way to say this is either difficult or possible. What I think is really amazing about DM, I could never even imagine that we would be able to make this. But it's possible, and the world engages with it. So we're real in the world in some sense. So I think that's, I hope, a gift to say, look, to designers, it is plausible. But I also want to be clear, it isn't a function of two designers sitting there and going, I'm going to draw a system map of the problem, and somehow we'll be able to engage.
Right.
And this is where I worry about what I would call the visual design interpretation of this problem space, which turns it into I can draw a map, thereby I understand the problem. Territory and the map are fundamentally different, and comprehension of the territory is a different art to comprehension of the map, or to be able to describe the map. So I think this is a critical space of operating, but it requires a different pathway of how you operate and different capabilities that have to be grown and developed to be able to operate across those landscapes. Otherwise, we will end up with another version of what I would call impressionistic art from architecture, which is that, we read some philosophy and write some impressionistic novels.
Right.
And
do have a history of doing that.
right, precisely. And this is my real intellectual problem right now with the space of kind of architectural theory, which I think is largely impressionistic.
Yeah.
It's more impressionistic art than it is actually fundamentally a theory. So I only say this as a word of caution, not in any way to diminish that this shouldn't be done, but just recognize what needs to be done and what the journey is to be able to construct that, and what that really means in terms of building polymathic capabilities and all those things. And I think the opportunity, the gift that I perhaps had was part of learning from OpenDesk, WikiHouse, and all these things. So the one thing I'd say is that every one of the things we've done is a function of adjacent possibles, right? So the first thing we did was we built the urban beach with Melissa Mean and Demos. And in the act of building that, we lost £35,000 because we did, and we physically designed it, got planning permission, found out you can't get planning permission for real-time material sourcing functions, and negotiated with planners to how to hack the system, all the way through to going profit relationships with bars who are ethical bars and everything else, and realizing if you do profit relationships, nobody will declare a profit, finding out licensing limits. So in the act of the actual making of the institution, recognizing by programming certain music, you would reduce the risk of violence in spaces because it would attract children, and thereby people wouldn't turn up with that. So what you realize was that this was a craft, a learning through craft. And I think in order to talk about the architecture we're talking about, it is a learning through craft function as opposed to a learning through abstraction function. And I think I just want to make that point, because often, I suppose, I get on the other side of this, where I have architecture students coming up to me and saying, I can do systems, can I be a system designer? I was like, well, not really. That's not the route.
That soundbreak was made by the Vietnam-based sound artist Thierry Bernard, a piece made especially for us at this podcast called Drifting Matter. I'm glad you raised the permissioning conversation. We've been doing some collaboration with Unji Kang on that part of that project, and it's a powerful idea, but slippery to a lot of people, particularly students who are confronting it for the first time. It's potentially disruptive, but also incredibly effective in making cities used more intensely. I'm just wondering, can you paint a picture of how, or maybe you don't want to do this, or how a city might look, or what's the extent to which such an idea can really recast how we use the hardware we've already got?
Yeah, so multiple horizons of this. One is simple thesis on utility of the reality is we are living in a carbon constrained landscape. We don't actually have the carbon budgets for mass new construction, which most people are ignoring. So one is just, schools are utilized 17% of the time. And that utility gap, 17% as opposed to, is a function not of design. We often think it's a design problem. It's actually an insurance problem, right? It's a problem of permissions and insurance. It's a problem of if somebody uses a school and something happens, who has the insurance liability, and how do you devolve that insurance liability in new ways? This goes back to the earlier conversation about the contract and relationship of that. Now, if we can increase the utility of the environment, we have that. That's the first horizon. Second horizon of this, it starts to change the nature of the object form itself, i.e. the house, non-house, right? The beyond house. The object is no longer driven through single point functionality. Third, it drives as a result of that move from architecture as function driven, but architecture as landscape driven, let's say architecture as landscape, is that you start to increase the durability of architecture because suddenly it's not tied to function and value is no longer tied to function. Fourth, you then start to change the investment class of architecture because it's no longer tied to function, and thereby you create new forms of liquidity. Now that starts to sort of lay out a different landscape of how we use. Now then there opens up a whole other conversation, which is I think going to be equally as important, is who owns the materials of cities. And certainly you start to talk about materials being put into public trusts and they're being part of public circular supply chains. We know that timber in a building needs to be stored there for 500 years or sequestered there for 500 years. So who owns the material relationships on those things? So our strategy, if you want to call it that, is to pull an adrenous thread, pull this little red thread a little bit, and unfurl what is a whole bunch of orthodoxies that are, and because we're pulling a very particular thread that has economic efficiency and utility value to it, it has the economic alignment to pull. That's basically it. And then it opens up transformation also on the governance side. So our theory of regulation starts to be transformed from what I'd call functional regulation to outcome regulation, and then there's a whole bunch of questions about real-time governance of those outcome regulations. So that's really the play.
Yeah,
and I didn't describe the city, but hopefully that leaves enough space to see what the city would feel like.
Yeah, no, it's a really great description of possibilities. We had some experience of doing something akin to that with the Victorian government departments a few years ago, and it came down to HR policies, IT systems not talking to each other between departments. But I think there's also just a capacity to imagine the city looking entirely differently as a result of that. And also this sort of sense, what you call single point of functionality is such a deeply ingrained idea. The Department of Health is defined, it's in the name, and it's separate from another department which does a different function, and overcoming that is really, really difficult.
You're absolutely right. It is difficult, and I think once you say it, it can't be unseen. So if I'm a public sector partner saying I'm going to invest in a school, let's say, use the kind of old point, education department, we need a new school, and then you say, right, we also need a neighborhood cooling center, right? i.e. in overheat days we need that. Second, you say, well, actually we also need to talk about ecological infrastructures at the neighborhood level. Okay, we start to fuse that. We need to think about community energy, and we need to use this as a site of community energy because it actually creates systemic resilience in terms of being able to trade on this. Then you can start to talk about neighborhood level governance, and you can start to talk about quadratic funding layered into that infrastructure. So I think what we're seeing is a forcing function happen where government departments are recognizing that their single point. I've just talked about some things. I could carry on talk about health. I could talk about loads of other dimensions, food grade, whatever. I think most people are starting to recognize that they don't have the capital. We don't have the capital resources to do those investments for single point returns. And so we're starting to see is combinatorial investments becoming the nature of how we allocate. And it also requires us to build new capabilities. Like we were going back to the earlier point, is it called a school anymore? And this is, I think, much more, it's a subtle point, but if we're still defining the problem through the theory of school, you've got such a powerful default in the comprehension and the nature of the brief that you're solving the wrong way. And also, in this theory of what I'd call multi-outcome input-output negotiation, right? So it's a synthesis across multiple inputs of desires and multiple outcomes of, and multiple outputs and multiple outcomes that are derived on the side, there is an act of negotiation and synthesis. Right? Not just negotiation and synthesis, i.e. being able to combine obliquely to a new advantage point. I think that is a new type of architectural response. It is the act of negotiation, not to a single brief, but the multiplicity of briefs and responsibilities over time. And thereby you start to talk about the public interest nature of the architect, because you're negotiating between multiple interests. You don't have a single liability problem, you have a public liability problem. And I think that starts to gear a new form of public endeavour, which is why architects, if we look at our boards, our sort of registration boards, they invite us to look after the public interest as a predominant. And I think we can return back to that question.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to now create the responsibility to learning back to that function. And maybe in this process we also delegitimize the need for planning as a top-down presumption of what is appropriate for every location, because then it's an emergent function of relationships. And so what planning becomes is the quality of relationship and evolution of synthesis, the constitution of design, as opposed to the design object. So anyway, just playing.
Mm. No, I think that's really fascinating, because it also, I guess, leads to the point about, coupling or decoupling or recoupling. And I was sort of thinking about, an essay by the architect Reinier de Graaf a few years ago in Architectural Review, where he talked about that architecture is now a tool of capital, and it's complicit in a purpose that's antithetical to its sort of social mission. And I think a lot of these ideas sort of relates to, I think, ways in which we can, conceptualize new sort of frameworks. And I'm curious about what your thoughts are on, the potentials and opportunities for this decoupling. And if there are, even if you talked about, for instance, real estate, if there are ways in which we could reimagine land tenure models or even de-link architecture from speculative value.
I think that's a really important question. And I think I sometimes worry that we borrow relatively cheap economic activism policies into our landscape.
Mm.
Speculatism, if I talked about speculativism, it's also the site of speculation of the possible, of the value that is not yet seen, of the liminal future.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we talk about speculative investments, what we're talking about is somebody speculating with regards to the future for the accumulation of capital and value.
Right.
And I think it's just kind of important to. So So you have Patrick Schumacher, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm worried about some of these what I'd call architectural polemics that are played out.
Of course, yeah.
Because fundamentally, an architecture is a flow of capitals.
Mm.
It is a flow of capitals. We knot capital together in multiple forms. It's usually money is a monetary function for that, but whether it's natural capital and other forms of capital, we weave capital together.
Mm.
And the question is, who has the power in society to weave capital together, and where does the power and capital distributed to be able to weave that capital together? And then who is that capital being extracted from, and what is the relationship of value of extraction and harm that's constructed in the act of the synthesis of the new? What is that relationship of trade that we are doing? How transparent is that conversation? How beneficial is it? Is it only viable for the 8 years of the business model after which that capital is so diminished that actually it's been consumed, or is it durable beyond the synthetic capital accumulation that was done in there? I suppose what I'm looking. Of course, I don't agree with speculative real estate development and blah blah blah. But what I'm looking for is a little, like, sort of what I'd call humble inquiry into these conversations.
Of course, yeah.
Because I worry that we adopt the language of activists, and we are not activists. We are makers of the future.
Yes.
And we have a responsibility to multiple stakeholders with regards to that future. And we have the need to negotiate between multiple actors in that framework. And I think there are so many brilliant scaffolds for us to say, there's not just one. We often reduce everything to financial capital. It's just one of many capitals. We can often talk about investment as an allocation of resources, but we also have gifting, we also have care. So we can expand the theory of the economics of these relationships in different ways. A tree planted by communities has a 90% chance of survival versus a tree planted by a private contract with a local authority, which has a 50% chance of survival, because the relationship with care fundamentally changes the economics of these things. So I want to not, personally, I'm trying to resist operating in that space and to operate. I mean, Melbourne, you guys had love letters being sent to trees, right? People are sending love letters to trees, and I want to engage in the fullness of the economy rather than the derivatives of a political debate, which actually are partial. They're not even sophisticated in my views. So I suppose it's one of my points. I have a bad reaction to those conversations because it's not because I don't understand the ethics and the morality of what's being said. I totally get that, but I'm not sure it's helpful for us to be operationalizing that way. I think we can expand the conversation. We can understand the value in different ways, and we can work with literacy to go beyond those narratives in different formats. And that's, I suppose, my intuitive response. I'm being as honest as I can.
It's very, very much on point. Yeah.
It's amazing set of thoughts to leave us with. We're conscious of time, and we promise to get you to your next appointment. So we really appreciate the time that you've
10 minutes, we can go for it if you like.
Planetary civics?
Do you want to talk about planetary civics? Yeah, well, that
whatever you like, guys. I mean, I don't have an issue. So, we've got 10 minutes. We can keep going.
Okay, fabulous.
So if there's points that you want to pull into it. But there's not. I'm sure we're going to delete this section, but
we'll chop out the.
But I'm not particularly interested in any marketing story. So, if I like the integrity of the conversation we're having here.
Yeah,
I prefer that than any sort of fluff.
Same, and we're keen to take it wherever it goes. But maybe we should talk specifically about planetary civics as a term, thinking about a wider audience that might never have encountered it. And you've kind of unpacked a lot of the ideas already.
Yeah, so I mean, our journey with civics has been, for a long time. I mean, so we were fortunate or sort of challenged enough to write the Compendium for the Civic Economy in 2010, which was then forwarded by the Prime Minister at the UK. By civics, we were talking about these multiple economies of relationship, that financial value being only one form of value. And actually, there's a whole class of these objects that work at the intersection of multiple forms of exchanges. So gift exchanges, care exchanges, financial exchanges coming together to create something that no single dominant form of capital by itself could create by itself, and why these things were really important. And this started not just as an inquiry into writing a book. We were obviously building impact hubs. We were building Bristol Urban Beach. It was a practice, a living construction, and it wasn't design practice. It was a design and making practice that we were learning from, and then reflecting back into these economies and learning, boring things like if I have a cake, right? And I remember my CFO at the time of building an impact hub told me, you got to cut the cake into 12 slices, so I know there's 12 slices, so I can price that into my Excel. And I was like, yeah, but you see, I don't want to do that because I want people to feel the generosity to cut whichever size of cake they want. And that to me is more valuable than me pre-cutting the slices, because I know those signals and behaviors of generosity create a different tone in a system and create a different relationality. And this was a dialogue with the CFO, our CFO, for that impact hub, not the group, and the relationship between accounting and value, and often I would say, but financial value is a dragging dragging indicator. It tells you what's happened when it's already happened. Whereas social indicators and nuances, so for example, if somebody is cutting that cake and taking half of a cake, let's say, you know you fucked up somewhere already
Mm.
because you've destroyed the social contract somewhere that somebody can act in that abusive manner.
Yes.
Right? So our ability to constantly be able to negotiate, and this is what I meant by the learning and craft of a simple cake, as opposed, and this is just a symbol of many things. So we, at Practica, were building this stuff. So compendium of civic economy was kind of a with practical action. But what was then, over many years, what was also becoming very clear is that there are classes of objects, and I use the word objects in a kind of you could use Timothy Horton's framework of hyperobjects, these planetary scale things, which have planetary scale relationality that require a new theory of governance and stewardship and design in a different way. So if you look at whether the Alps as a mountain range, it's a transnational mountain range. It has got glaciers. Those glaciers are systemically in a situation where by 2070 there will be no more glaciers in the Alps, and with the loss of those glaciers you will almost certainly lose predictable water systems across Europe, and by implication not only will you lose predictable water systems, you'll lose associated agricultural infrastructure across that stream. So what you start to realize is that those glaciers are forms of these relational critical generative nodes that are massive transnational effects. And what we're finding is that the site of the River Danube, for example, which I think is just a bleak but an important journey. River Danube was a site of trade wars and literal wars, and was also the birthplace after those wars of international waters. The conception of international waters was rooted in the River Danube as a result of actually trying to find a new space of negotiation. So what we've been looking at is these planetary scale objects, like glacier systems, like whales. Right? Whales is a form of planetary object because they exist at the kind of scale of the planetary scale. That if you can look at means to actually not just conserve them because conservation no longer works in a planet which is in climate breakdown pathways and are degrading at a level, we need to regenerate them, which is a fundamentally different problem from what I'd call the allocation of resources problem. So you have a stable system and you're saying how much water do you get, how much water do you get is one problem space, but we're no longer in that problem space. We're in a problem space where we have to regenerate and maintain that infrastructure, and there is going to be an investment required to the maintenance of that transnational benefit infrastructure. So our capacity to create new forms of negotiation, new forms of diplomacy, new types of institutions gives us a sight of a new theory of planetarity, which is not rooted in New York. It's rooted in a sight of the ground. And now with new computational institutions being made possible, i.e. real-time analysis and allocation, being able to verify, being able to look at the regenerative effects, looking at dynamics and water flows, you can start to create new forms of transnational institutions which are not only governing these sites and shared governance of these sites, which are computational, but also looking at new forms of transnational development banks rooted into those frameworks. So, and then what we're looking at is new techniques and technologies for not just the preservation of those, but the regeneration of these glacier systems and the augmentation of these glacier systems. So what we were looking for was a new space of planetary negotiation, which would allow an alternative to the world governance conversations that we end up defaulting into, how to reform the UN and so on, which, we've been part of conversations with the UNDP, obviously, but it felt like there was a different pathway to the construction of the planetary, as opposed to a new pathway to resolving the global. And I use those words very particularly. The global is the theory of the abstract notion of the planet, and the planet is the entanglement of these relationships in a very particular way. So planetary civics is the recognition of the planetary nature of these things, but also the relational quality of these things. And the legitimacy function of the construction of these things will no longer be the negotiation between one of the two states, but the negotiation in space and time in forms of relationality. So it was a very particular identification of a site of operation, which is critical in terms of what we see as a planetary scale risk profile.
Right.
It's marvellous to hear all that, especially in the context of, the world events of the last 24 hours, I must say.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No, it's a pleasure.
So today's conversation has really opened up a lot of questions about the unseen forces shaping our cities, governance, finance, law, and the infrastructures that dictate what gets built, where and for whom. With Indy, we've explored how Planetary Civics seeks to rewire these systems, shifting from extraction to regeneration, from speculation to stewardship, and from imposed hierarchies to distributed agency. The work of Dark Matter Labs and Indy really challenges us to rethink our cities, not as an industry of objects, but as a field of institutional and systematic transformations. So thanks to Indy for sharing his insight, for stimulating us to think beyond what's visible, helping us to imagine new civic architectures for an entangled planet. And thanks for our listeners for joining us in this conversation. Until next time.
You're hearing us thanks to the generous support of the Alistair Swain Foundation and the RMIT University School of Architecture and Urban Design. We would like to acknowledge the people of the Bunwurrung and Woiwurrung language groups on whose unceded country we are recording this podcast, and extend that acknowledgement to all First Peoples of Australia who have been caring for the many layers of country for over 60,000 years.